removal of the guru meditation era, replaced with a much more mundane message. Perhaps the most striking difference was the startup boot request and general visuals of the new Workbench desktop. The original high contrast environment was very much designed for fuzzy monitors and televisions. However, with new higher quality displays, a more elegant approach was implemented. The 500 Plus would also see Amiga's second best-selling bundle, the familiar Cartoon Classics pack, complete with The Simpsons, Captain Planet, and the key titles of Deluxe Paint 3 and Lemmings. Deluxe Paint 3 was actually a significant improvement for the series, introducing animation and ham abilities, and combined with the Tank Mouse, like the Batman pack, this bundle introduced a pool of 90s kids to the wonder of digital creativity. Given Commodore had dropped the underwhelming and error-prone Amiga Basic from Workbench 2, you could also grab yourself GFA Basic, Photon Paint 2, and an arcade games pack with the Silica Systems bundle. The suggested bundle price was £359, but this was a time when third-party vendors were going out of their way to try and make their offers more appealing than their competitors, and it brought about a welcoming wave of price wars, and pages of salivatingly tempting goods. Man, the early 90s, what a time to be alive. It was also a time which witnessed the ever-growing peak of two homegrown scenes. These were the public domain and the demo scenes. Public domain was running ahead at great speed thanks to the lack of licensing on the Amiga, with coders trying their hand at software creation before sending it off to one of the vast PD libraries for redistribution, usually without any monetary reward for their hard coding hours. But the demo scene was something different. Although it emerged on earlier 8-bit systems, in its current guise it was more or less a descendant of the virus, which made its way onto the Amiga way back in 1987 as coders devised more and more ingenious ways of exploiting the machine's hardware. Discs and discs of demos became available from various groups, each trying to outdo each other in the graphical and sound stakes. Sometimes fighting competitor machines such as the ST, but also trying to beat other Amiga coders. These demos really exploited the bare metal coding which Commodore was trying to keep people away from, but it made amazing things possible. Like the 8-bit cassette tape scene, this was also an era of pirating, or cracking, something that is often attributed to the demise of the Atari ST.
The worst use certainly has to be as a home games machine. There are very few good games for it,
with its standard MS-DOS compatible file system. But thanks to programs like Xcopy, it was perfectly possible to duplicate most Amiga discs, and there was an entire black market of people pirating games and condensing them onto single floppies. Groups like the Medway Boys weren't just prolific on the ST scene. The cracking scene actually went hand in hand with the demo scene, as groups clamoured to post their latest, most impressive visuals and soundtracks onto the loading screen of games. Those who wanted their games cheap also got a healthy injection of demo finesse, and were probably all the more enlightened because of it. Although bulletin board systems were available which offered some questionable downloads, including disc magazines created and distributed by each group, often which attacked each other in normal adolescent schoolboy behaviour, the phone prices were expensive, as was the technology to access them, so these scenes created their own wake of demo and copy parties where people would lug their machines to large venues to share their code, to see what other people were producing, or just to copy mountains and mountains of floppies, and that's probably where you got most of yours from, even if it wasn't first hand. It's in this sort of environment that we witnessed many of the great programmers of the time and of today, a breeding ground of creativity and love for the freedom brought about by this new hardware. Elsewhere, away from the crazy copy parties and with the relative security brought by licensed cartridge games, the Super Nintendo was wangling its way into households alongside Sega's Mega Drive. Whilst in the high-end computing scene, Intel's 486 processor combined with VGA graphics were morphing the IBM PC compatibles into not only a productivity pack horse, but also a formidable gaming platform, with a much greater scope for upgrade than any existing platform. In fact, even though machines like the ST and Amiga usually had better versions, MS-DOS accounted for 82% of computer game sales at this point, although this was heavily slanted by American figures. Over in Europe the balance was much more even. Some 7 years had passed since the original Amiga, and on the surface of it very little had changed with the hardware.
Heavy, man.
Owners and press were beginning to feel a little uncomfortable with the platform's future, and so it was with open arms that several new machines were welcomed by the latter part of 1992. The first was a bit of an oddball, in that it was essentially just an Amiga 500 Plus, but in a smaller case. The Amiga 600 was intended to originally be the Amiga 300, a low-end bottom-of-the-range version of the 500, designed to complement the 500 and take on the lower-cost 16-bit consoles. However, higher than expected costs meant it would actually be sold at a higher price than the 500 and was therefore renamed and shipped as a replacement, leading to the 500 Plus being one of the shortest living systems at just under 6 months. The 600 was launched during March 1992's CeBIT show and was in the shops by the summer for a whopping £399, missing the console price point entirely. Despite this and the lack of numeric keypad, the 600 did have some advantages, such as the capacity for an internal hard drive, side PCMCIA slot and a built-in RF modulator. The price point was quickly dropped to $299 and then to just £199, infuriating original buyers, but bundles such as the Wild, the Weird and the Wicked helped sell machines with similar lineups to its predecessors. Now, almost immediately after launching the Australian-built 600, Commodore announced 2 higher power machines before the end of the year. This, of course, caused consumers to wait rather than buying the 600 and led to increased financial pressure, resulting in the closure of their Australian office to cut costs.
Watch out, computers have got curly!
The technology for the new machines had actually been on the agenda for some time. Hopping back to 1989, which seems to be some kind of central nexus point for the brand, Commodore had begun creating a new state-of-the-art chipset. This technology was designed to retain Amiga's cutting-edge credentials and address critics of the lackluster upgrades seen since 1985. This AAA advanced Amiga architecture was designed to break from the original custom architecture and would only be compatible at a basic level with previous software. In line with previous designs, a custom set of chips was conceived: Andrea, Linda, Mary and Monica. But the setup was conceived as a much more modular approach, similar to IBM PC compatibles, allowing for easier upgrade routes. However, parallel to this, a Commodore International team led by Bill Sidneys, the new head of engineering, were also working on the Pandora chipset, later changed to AA chipset and standing for Advanced Architecture. This architecture was an incremental upgrade, like ECS, designed to offer an upgrade on the Amiga 3000 hardware, but with a number of significant improvements. By 1992, the AAA chipset was looking like it would only be slightly faster than the much easier to implement and fully completed AA chipset, and so was cancelled in favour of a new Hombre chipset, another Spanish word relating to a friendly male, and based on the PA RISC architecture. The AA chipset was then gifted a name tweak to AGA to emphasise the improved graphics abilities whilst avoiding potential trademark problems with a well-known automobile company. The Amiga Advanced Graphics Architecture was launched in August 1992 in a high-end 3000 replacement, the Amiga 4000.
And it produces some pretty spectacular special effects. If you're a Babylon 5 fan, you'll recognise that, of course, as the Vorlon spaceship. How does it work? Well, I shall show you.
The Amiga OS was now at version 3, featuring improved visuals and colour options, along with CD support and a new data type system. Under the hood, the faithful Denise chip was replaced with Lisa, and Agnes with Alice, offering a logical step up on the hardware, and one which, if released a couple of years prior, could have made as much impact as the original hardware in 1985. The 32-bit AGA architecture was actually cut down from what was originally intended. Prototypes of 3000 plus units show support for a digital signal processor and 16-bit stereo hardware codecs, similar to what Atari had just released with their impressive but expensive ST upgrade, the Falcon. But like Atari, both companies were going through a barrage of cost-cutting exercises. Profits throughout 1992 had almost halved since 91, and market share was being lost to the ever-expanding competition. The AGA chipset offered a number of significant improvements over previous Amiga machines, and still provided the niche graphics and video advantages the platform was known for, but nothing that would send the competition packing, and lacking flicker-free high-resolution modes that other similar-priced systems now had as standard.
In a minute, but first, I am Stunt Pilot Cobra, off to see the Stunt Coordinator.
Okay, Cobra. Congratulations. You made it to the show.
Thank you, sir.
The 8040 sold for almost £2,500, putting it at the upper price point even for IBM PC compatibles, meaning its penetration was again limited and specialist. By the 21st of October, an entry-level AGA machine, the A1200, was released in worldwide regions, including Japan and America.
Now, I know the Amiga's been around for 8 years already, but this new machine is being sold on its fantastic graphics and colours. Apparently, it has up to 17 million different colours available, whatever that means.
But as you'd expect, it was Europe, and mainly the UK in particular, where interest spiked. Existing Amiga owners weren't keen to jump onto consoles, and IBM compatibles were still eye-wateringly expensive. At a base price of just £399 in the UK, or $599 in the States, the 1200 was a tantalising prospect, and this seemed to be a rare instance where the technology was right, the price level was right, and the brand name was right to really make an impact. And it did! Demand was very high for the system, particularly in the UK for the Christmas 1992 period.
However, if you're thinking of upgrading your hardware, beware. 1/3 of existing Amiga software won't run on this machine. The trouble is, nobody knows which third, not even the manufacturers.
But our old friend production problems meant only 30,000 1200s were available at launch, spilling orders over to 1993. And with the CD-TV discontinued, this was also the year that the A570 CD-ROM drive for the 500 machine was launched. Designed to be compatible with CD-TV software, it was late to the market and actually released after the 500 was discontinued. But given the existing user base of some 2 million owners, it was deemed worthwhile. Uptake was limited, but started the wave of compilation CDs containing hundreds, if not thousands of PD programs, demos and images, which caused myself a considerable drooling frenzy. This was exactly the pairing that could have made Amiga a runaway success in the early 90s if it had come instead of a CD-TV. It's not hard to imagine some amazing enhanced versions of Cinemaware games brought to fruition, amongst others, rather than limited to the cramped conditions of a floppy disk and arm-aching disk swapping sessions. But like most of the Amiga story, it was in slightly the wrong place and at the wrong time. The start of 1993 witnessed a price cut of all non-AGA machines, but the AGA line continued to sell well, with over 100,000 machines sold by March. However, this was not enough to offset the seemingly spiralling profits. With the 500 discontinued and the 600 already an out-of-date technology, reliance was heavily placed on the performance of the new hardware. But this was an era of vast competition, all trying to make strides in new innovations. Although the 1200 sported a Motorola 6J020 processor, it was still a CPU originally released way back in 1984, before the original Amiga was even on sale. By now, Sega's Mega CD add-on was available.
To be a Mega CD star.
Real tough. You try dying 2,000 times a day.
Hey you! Yeah you! Billy from Romford! You don't zap her on my show! Get Mega CD! Right click, take the trip! Whoa!
Demos of the new 3DO console were showing us what the future held.
3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
And Atari, having discontinued the Falcon, were making a last-ditch attempt by whispering something about a 64-bit super console.
The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits, which is more advanced. Clifford! 16 and 32 are less than 64. Still with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced! Can you repeat the question? Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
These machines would come to fruition before the year was out, but not before Commodore finally got a grip on what the market had been demanding all this time: a cutting-edge games machine. The idea originally tossed around between Jay and the Amiga team way back in 1982, and it still seemed to be the way forward some 10 years later.
Incredible graphics and colors, so many colors.
Codenamed Spellbound, the CD32 was announced at the London Science Museum on July 16, 1993, and released in September at the World of Commodore Amiga show, beating both the 3DO and Jaguar to the post and claiming the title of the first 32-bit CD-based games console released in the European region. It also significantly undercut the competition in terms of pricing, launching at £299. The same price for £1200 was also lowered to. Compared to a Mega CD at £369 with the cost of the Mega Drive on top, this was a significant saving, and it led to substantial sales for the compact keyboardless Amiga 1200 in a grey box. The machine's similarity to the 1200 was one of the main reasons Commodore were able to get the machine out to market so quickly, and David Pleasance, along with Commodore UK, entered an aggressive marketing strategy akin to Sega's Nintendo slating approach from a few years prior.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Even erecting a huge billboard outside Sega UK's offices, playing on Sega's own marketing slogan, and it's still one of my favourite marketing campaigns to date. Although the CD32 was largely cross-compatible with the 1200, a new Akiko chip was added under the hood. This little chip was able to perform chunky to planar conversions, which would ordinarily consume many cycles of the 68020 processor. It was requested by Amiga's software group, as most software was currently being developed in chunky pixel mode, suitable for PCs. This function converted these chunky pixels to Amiga bitplanes, allowing 3D based games to run faster than a base standard 1200. After all, the Amiga hardware may have been incredibly optimized for 2D, but those same optimizations proved somewhat of a hindrance for the new 3D games emerging, and although Akiko was a helpful addition, it would still be unable to keep up with the technology that was just around the corner. And what the system did have was a wealth of existing Amiga titles that could be easily adapted to the console, which was both a great selling point, but like other super consoles of the time, a downfall, as the technology didn't seem to improve on what we already had. Titles that shipped with the CD32 bundles completely failed to cast the machine in a respectable light. Despite this, the console sold well, as gamers clamoured to get their hands on a machine that could fulfill their playground boasting requirements.
And you get this rather strange shaped controller. Why it's this shape, I've no idea. It doesn't seem to improve playability. In fact, it's just a nuisance. You also get two games. You get a game called Oscar and this one, Diggers, which is, well, it takes ages to get going, and then it's really slow, and it's sort of like Lemmings, but it's nowhere near as much fun. But amazing 32-bit games are coming, they promise us. This is called Rise of the Robots, a futuristic beat-em-up that makes full use of the machine's huge palette of over 16 million colours.
The console was also launched in Canada, and although planned and advertised in the United States, a legal dispute with CAD-Track over their use of the XOR cursor technique, used for displaying the cursor over the background image, prevented the machines being imported from their Philippine stockpile until a $10 million settlement was paid. And despite the tenuous technical grounds, which logically made no sense, the court favoured a tenuous verdict against Commodore, which they simply couldn't afford to pay. Some say this was the final blow for Commodore, but they were already on unstable ground by this point. 1993 had seen the company lose an astonishing $356 million.
$1 million.
And even though the CD32 was selling well, their Philippine stock was held until they could make payment. Despite this, almost 100,000 machines were sold in Europe, outselling its rivals, with demand still going strong into 1994. But Commodore simply ran out of units, and with component supply problems and mounting debts, simply couldn't make any more. Now, when you consider that some of the finest, groundbreaking and innovative games the platform had witnessed had also come during these years, with software houses like Team 17 churning out a record 9 games in 1993 and sharing Publisher of the Year awards with Electronic Arts, it's easy to become a little sad and somewhat miffed at the state of the Amiga's proceedings by this point.
Super Frog.
Everyone likes a beat-em-up, and Amiga owners will really love this one. It's called Shadow Fighter. It's one of the few beat-em-ups to be developed specifically for computer formats as opposed to consoles. Once you've defeated all challengers, you get to compete against the mighty Shadow Fighter. There's a training level where you get to bash up a puppet opponent. Out next week on Amiga with CD32 versions early next year.
But how did we get here? How had the Amiga gone from such promise to such a low in a short space of time? Well, there are two ways of looking at this. Both are valid and both played their part. The first is in the hardware itself, the very thing that had provided the Amiga with so much promise from the beginning. The custom chipset helped career the technology above the Mac and other computers of the time by offloading much that others coded into software, but it also locked the engineers into a narrow specification of what they could change and what they couldn't. For example, the NTSC and power resolutions were a sticking point of the technology, and the chip research team just didn't have the funding to make the jumps they needed. Not only this, but being tied to Motorola processors, the very core of the technology was out of their hands. Whilst Intel created faster and faster chips that could be plonked into IBM PC compatibles, Motorola struggled to keep up, bailing completely on the 68000 line in 1994 and choosing to enter a partnership with IBM and Apple to develop PowerPC hardware. It's hard to see how any competitor could have fought off the emerging dominance and economies of scale brought about by the IBM PC compatible. The Amiga's days as a gaming platform were pretty much numbered, with the arrival of Doom in 1993 and the immersive CD-ROM based games like Myst, which turned the glare of many a gamer and publishing house eager to change their tactics. The other way is by looking at the management, and it's a view which is tied into hardware development. In various conversations, David Haney has expressed how the funding just wasn't in the right places. The AAA architecture took some 5 years to almost complete before being dropped. A staggering waste of time and money that could have been condensed into a shorter timescale and ensured the Amiga's future from the outset of the 90s. Haney talked about how the successful engineering management team was replaced by a bunch of idiots by 1991. The same idiots who thought up the Amiga 600, which David Pleasance described as an absolute shambles and waste of time, and the same people who intentionally delayed the AGA chipset. Layer upon layer of bad decision was made, mainly from Irving Gold and Mehdi Ali, who seemed transfixed on short-term goals and were primarily responsible for the R&D shortages, whilst raking in a huge salary and bonus which could have alone helped the chipset funding massively.
And all this bullshit that you think is so important, you can just kiss all that goodbye.
Although it's worth noting that without Irving and his investments, we wouldn't have Commodore or the Amiga possibly at all.
This installation has a substantial dollar value attached to it.
It's with an extreme sense of ellipsism that we'll never know what the Amiga could have been if perhaps Thomas Rattigan had remained at the helm for a few more years. The last Amiga to roll out from Commodore during March 1994 was the 4000 Tower, a highly upgradable version of the 4000 complete with both SCSI and IDE interfaces, and sold as a high-end video workstation. However, only small numbers were shipped before Commodore International was forced into bankruptcy protection on April the 29th at 4 PM, leaving their other subsidiaries such as Commodore UK short on machines and support. The last project demonstrated was the CD1200 prototype at the CeBIT 94 show, which, incorporating the Akiko chip, would have allowed the Amiga 1200 to run CD32 games. David Haney documented the end times of Commodore through his deathbed vigil video, which makes for some fascinating viewing.
Get out, get out. This is my lab equipment.
I'm not taking any lab equipment. All I'm stealing are images today.
The sad news of Commodore International's demise was further compounded in June when Jay Miner, the father of the Amiga, passed away from heart failure after suffering from kidney complications. His words, expressed at the end of the 80s,
"Amiga is so far behind Macintosh and IBM right now, and they've lost so much momentum and position that I think it's going to be almost impossible to recover."
Seemingly ran true, although he applauded the work David Haney and the crew had managed to complete with the AGA enhancements against the odds of their management. In spite of this wave of sad news, the shining light of Amiga, Commodore UK, was actually still solvent, and it didn't take long for joint directors David Pleasance and Colin Proudfoot to announce they were looking to buy out the remaining trademarks and assets of Commodore themselves, which included 3,300 CD32s still sitting in the Philippines and valued at just $22.50 each. A glimmer of hope spread through the Amiga community, with Colin commenting,
"There should be no impact in the UK marketplace. The brand is too strong to die. We're confident the Commodore and the Amiga will come out of this a better, stronger company."
The duo's plan was to initiate a management buyout and operate the company under the name Amiga International. However, as 1995 chugged over, it was apparent that there would be other cash-rich bidders, including IBM, Dell, Creative Equipment International, Samsung and Escom. Dell and CEI came close to what was described as a hideously complex morass of companies spread over several businesses. But almost a year after declaring bankruptcy on the 20th of April 1995, it was the PC brand Escom who picked up the core Commodore business for some $11 million, after bids from other companies were ruled invalid. Escom weren't a company adverse to risk, and shunning convention had recently announced it would be shipping OS 2 as the standard operating system on all their PCs rather than Windows. They were also in the fairly unique position of having a chain of retail shops across the UK and Germany, which could be used to sell their new stock. Pleasance and Proudfoot backed down after it was apparent they couldn't match the bid, and instead agreed to work alongside Escom to establish a future for the Amiga. Almost immediately afterwards, Escom announced their plans to resume production of the AGA machines via a manufacturing plant in China, a point which raised concern for some given China's human rights record and the not so distant memory of Tiananmen Square in 1989. The rebadged Commodore brand was put to use on a new line of PCs, and Amiga was split into a new subsidiary called Amiga Technologies GmbH, headed by a number of ex-Amiga people including Jonathan Anderson. Escom took on some 100 ex-Commodore staff in total and began work on repackaging the products and brand. By October, the Amiga Magic Pack was unveiled, consisting of a rebadged Amiga 1200 along with Wordsworth 4 SE, Data Store 1.1, TurboCalc 3.5, Photogenics 1.2 SE, Personal Paint 6.4, Organizer 1.1, Pinball Mania and Whiz. It was an all-encompassing bundle but lacked the standout games from the Amiga packs seen under David Pleasance's leadership. The price was also back up to the original launch price of £399 or £499 with a 170MB hard disk. Although there was still a relatively high demand for the machine, especially for users who had experienced the Amiga 500 either from new or through the expansive second-hand scene. Magazines at the time documented how hard it was to get an Amiga 1200 even second-hand, and most of them were selling for almost a brand new price. Despite all of this though, it felt like things would never be like they were, and that Amiga Technologies were perhaps driving down a path of expansion and destruction. By late 1995, Amiga enthusiast Petro Tishenko had taken over as CEO and president. A former Commodore Germany employee, he had been instrumental in setting up the Escom deal, and there was also talk of pushing out an Amiga RISC Power PC variant, possibly based on the Ombre chipset that would have included powerful 3D capabilities, and could have reignited the Amiga brand. However, you have to ask, due to the complete hardware rework, would it really have been an Amiga at all?
And this is the man behind Worms, programmer Andy Davidson. Welcome to that info. Thanks. And he slaved away in his bedroom for more than 2 years, working with his Amiga A1200 in Blitz Basic.
Surprisingly, software and add-ons were still appearing from third parties. The CD32SX add-on had launched in late 1994, allowing the CD32 to operate as a fully fledged Amiga, and an entire range of Doom clones was hitting the scene, demonstrating the love and determination for many to hang on to their beloved Amiga. Ironically, a community which perhaps wouldn't have been quite so prevalent had Commodore done their job properly in the earlier 90s, with many software houses, home brewers and third parties stepping up to fill the gaps which Commodore had left or simply neglected to fill. Early 1996 saw the relaunch of the Amiga 4000, followed by an announcement for the Amiga Mind Walker. This was the only machine which reached the prototype stage under ESCOM, and it combined the AGA architecture, a 68030 CPU, and mainstream components including a quad-speed CD-ROM, lowering the cost and allowing for expandability, despite its inhibitive appearance. However, just like Commodore, ESCOM entered liquidation a few months later. At one point, Viz Corp looked like it would buy the Amiga for use in set-top box technology, but this fell through as they seemingly went under as well. It seemed like everyone around the Amiga was falling, and not just companies looking to invest. Long-running magazines were coming to an end, and although games were still shipping out from loyal software houses, it was at a certainly slower rate than previous years. Despite this, those Amiga users who had upgraded and were holding on tight bore witness to some impressive games designed specifically for accelerated machines, including Alien Breed 3D 2 and NEMAC 4. Even Myst finally made an appearance, followed incredibly by both Doom and Quake conversions after the source code was released, but these were really the last glimmers of hope for the hardware. Previous ESCOM manufacturer QuickPack were the next company interested in purchasing the Amiga, and Dell were again on the prowl, but were beaten to the post by Gateway 2000, who were seeking to snap up the intellectual property of some 47 patents held by the existing company. Gaining the following of the existing Amiga base was a bonus, especially when you consider that Amigas were still swapping hands and in active use. And this is how I got my own Amiga 600 in early 1995, although I'm one of the people who quickly switched to PC before the year was out. Under Gateway, the separate Commodore brand was sold to Tulip Computers. Amiga Technologies was renamed to Amiga International, and Petro remained at the reins. At the World of Amiga 97 show, the company then announced they would be developing a new version of the Amiga OS, which finally emerged as Amiga OS 3.5 in 1999 under a new subsidiary, Amiga Incorporated. A promise was also made to build, or at least license out, the Amiga PowerPC once again. Further licensing deals led to Amiga technology appearing in a range of devices and clones under the Powered by Amiga logo, still sporting the aging AGA technology, with PowerPC boards also arriving around the same time. Pre-1993 ROMs and material were licensed to Cloanto, who still sell official emulation packages along with videos and materials from the early Amiga scene. Also announced in 1997 by Access Innovations and Mick Tinker was the Amiga Boxer development, a genuine upgrade of existing Amiga technology. However, this promising project was abandoned in 2001. In 1999, Gateway retained the Amiga patents but sold Amiga Incorporated itself to Amino Development for almost $5 million, who then renamed themselves to Amiga Corporation, while still retaining the Amiga Incorporated subsidiary, bringing it satisfyingly back to the company name first used by Jay and the team back in the early 80s. By May 2000, the stable of the Amiga community, Amiga Format, published its last issue, drawing to a close, for me at least, the original days of the Amiga. But it's not the end. The period up until now, including the contracted development of Amiga OS 4 by Hyperion Entertainment in 2004, is worth an entire documentary in itself, with various PowerPC variants shipped under the Amiga brand, a host of new accelerator cards including the Lightning Quick Vampire 2 for the Amiga 600, the ARM Eager system, and a massive emulation scene that encompasses both the 68000 and PowerPC technology. Amiga Incorporated would also move one last time under the ownership of KMOS Inc., where it merged into the Amiga Incorporated name. But it's not just there where we see the Amiga continuing. The influence of Amiga is evident in the very machines we use today. Even after the release of the first Amiga OS, both Microsoft and Apple were watching and implementing features into their own operating systems. The Amiga's unique design itself inspired countless engineers, and the games we witnessed on the platform leave a burning ember with the titles of today.